So I want to thank Jessica for the opportunity to come here and speak to you today. And our prior speakers really set me up well for this conversation with prior conversations around collaboration and talking about how we bring product to market, the different types of studies we can do. I'm also very excited to be here because 15 or more years ago, I started my medical device portion of my career working on high-intensity focused ultrasound at startup companies, working in the area of arteriotomy sealing and working with the DARPA on the deep bleeder acoustic coagulation cuff at some startup companies called Theris and Acoustic. And it's just fantastic to see how much the field has matured in the last 15 years. But what I noticed back then was that we built amazing engineering teams. And once we had a product ready to go to market and look to engaging patients and physicians and the regulatory agencies, we had a valley, the valley of death. But it was the valley of we didn't need the engineers and their science. We now needed to figure out how to engage with our regulatory organizations. So what I'm going to talk to you today is collaboration on regulatory science, which is the activity of looking at that regulatory phase of your product development life cycle and recognizing that there is science to be applied in that phase, science of developing the evidence of safety, efficacy, and performance of your device. So the Medical Device Innovation Consortium is a 501c3 public-private partnership, and we collaborate with industry, with FDA, with NIH, CMS, and other nonprofits and patient groups to work on regulatory science. We are really aimed at helping patients have access to the best new medical technology faster, safer, and more cost-effectively. We are a membership organization. We have 57 members, and the way that we do work is we have a board that identifies projects. Currently, we have 6 projects, and those projects work on creating methods, tools, and processes for developing evidence of safety, efficacy, and performance, and those projects are staffed largely by volunteers, and those projects demonstrate and reduce to practice regulatory science concepts. We're focused on our partnership with the FDA, and that partnership looks at aligning our work with the FDA CDRH strategic priorities. So the 3 fundamental strategic priorities FDA has is rebalancing the pre-market, post-market, such that there's a balance of evidence that are collected in the pre-market space with the evidence collected in the post-market space, and attempts to move more of that evidence collection into the post-market space, thereby accelerating product access to patients. Clinical trial reform to help bring down the cost of clinical trials to make them more efficient, and really to modernize the clinical trial enterprise so that we're taking advantage of 21st century technology and knowledge in conducting our clinical trials that have largely been left unchanged since the 20th century. And then finally, the newest component, the strategic priority FDA has for the science of patient input. And this is the idea and the burgeoning science that patients can be engaged scientifically in a validatable way to be part of the determination of things such as risk-benefit of a device and other considerations in the design of the clinical trial of a medical device. So MDIC, conducting their work on our projects, our 6 projects, we do our work through work streams, and the constellation of examples below show work streams that we have completed or recently started and how they align within those FDA strategic priorities. So within the pre-market, post-market balance, we've identified a way to statistically bring in prior information, prior evidence into a future clinical trial design so that each clinical trial is not an island unto itself, but that we're able to link the information and use that information to inform future work. We do that through a Bayesian framework, and it's a patient safeguard as well, because we've introduced a method to make sure that the evidence that is brought in is concordant with what is observed currently, and when it's discordant, that evidence is discarded. We've worked on a early feasibility study blueprint, which you can find on our website, and this takes the guidance documents that the FDA has put out and the real avant-garde initiative that they have to bring patient access to new products first in the world here in the US. And MDIC has created a blueprint of how smaller companies can help to think about operationalizing that IDE process that the FDA has built. And the content that I'll spend a little more time on today, because I think it's particularly important for the Focused Ultrasound Society and the, when I say society, I mean the general audience that makes up all of the folks interested in ultrasound, not just the scientists, not just the clinicians, but the patients, the caregivers, and the reimbursing folks. We have really made some strides in the science of patient input, but it's so new, and this is an opportunity to help bring folks up to speed on what's possible in that space. So these are three of the MDIC projects: clinical trial innovation and reform, the application of clinical trial practices, and patient-centered benefit risk assessment. Each of our projects is staffed by a board champion, someone from our board of directors. So for example, in the clinical trial innovation and reform, we have Rick Kuntz as our board champion, and he's the CSO from Medtronic. And we have an FDA partner on each of these projects as well. And on that same project, our FDA partner is Owen Ferris, who is the clinical trials director out of the Office of Science of Device Evaluation within FDA. And that helps make sure that we have a strategic partnership between the board of MDIC and our FDA partners in working on these projects and bringing them forward. This is, just to give you a little background, a snapshot of our board of directors from MDIC, and what you'll notice is that it has executives from both medical device industry, large and small, as well as nonprofits, government, and this comes together to help give us a balance of perspectives on the work that we do. So now I'll show you our membership roster, and I've got highlighted that of the members that we have, 55 on this chart, which is a couple of days old. We have 2 new members to make 57. The Focused Ultrasound Foundation is a member of MDIC, and through that, the smaller companies can work with MDIC to help think about regulatory science and learn about how they can apply regulatory science into their product development life cycle. So as mentioned, I'll take my short talk remaining time to focus on the science of patient input, kind of the newest area in the thinking of regulatory science. So there's 2 primary types of science that I'll talk about. One is patient preference information, and this can be used to help determine endpoints, effect size, help to support labeling changes or expansions on indications for use. And patient preference, the way I like to think about it, is you learn it through survey mechanisms. And it's not so much the extemporaneous, how do you feel, but it's more of like taking a Myers-Briggs survey where you can classify, you can find inherent characteristics of people and put them into the various classifications. For Myers-Briggs, it's personality types. With patient preference information, it's willingness to accept various trade-offs of different considerations of device performance. And then patient-reported outcomes, and these are the extemporaneous commentary that you get from folks in their clinical environment working with their physicians. And this is outcomes-focused, outcomes that can be collected in the post-market and can be of interest in determining things for payers, providers, and reimbursement. So MDIC, recognizing that patient preference is a very new area, created a seminal document that collected a catalog of all the methods that you can ascertain patient preference, the various survey methods, as well as a framework for how you would take this patient preference information and you would apply it to benefit risk determinations. So at the end of the day, when a device comes in to the FDA, you bring in your evidence of safety, of performance to help the FDA in their determination of risk-benefit. You can bring in patient preference information to also support that risk-benefit determination. And this framework talks about where, when, and how you would start to do that. I'm going to take a few moments to explain a couple examples of patient preference and how it comes to bear in decisions that are made. So this is an example of physicians who have responded to preferences for anticoagulants in atrial fibrillation versus U.S. respondents. And the areas that were of greatest concern were death, disabling stroke, non-disabling stroke, major bleeding, heart attack, and blood clot. These are the side effects, the risks, and the concerns. And the blue bars indicate the response level. And I'm going to highlight 2 blue bars because for the physicians, the biggest side effect, the biggest concern was the risk of death. This was their overriding consideration for determining whether or not to provide anticoagulants. For patients, the patients were less concerned about death, and the patients were more concerned about the possibility of a disabling stroke. And that was a big piece of a patient's consideration in whether or not they'd want to be anticoagulated for atrial fibrillation. And so this is an example of the variability that exists in preferences between different stakeholders. So it's very important to recognize that there's opportunities to engage with the patients, to elicit their preferences, and then to use that as science in the regulatory activities of submitting your evidence to your regulatory bodies. This is a picture of the total product life cycle from the far left-hand side, discovery, to product marketing at the far right-hand side. And there are places that patient preference can be used throughout that total product life cycle. We talked a little bit about the benefit-risk determination that happens at that regulatory decision phase. There is also the opportunity to use patient preference information in clinical trial design. So my last few slides will talk about that. So the patient values versus p-values is a nice quick quote that Andrew Lowe has coined that talks about p-values in clinical trials are based upon manufacturing principles. And we have an opportunity in the 21st century to think about the risk of false positive and false negative, not from a manufacturing perspective and locked in at a 5% level, but rather determining the p-values based upon patient values, really looking at the risk associated with that false positive and false negative from the patient's perspective. And so our next activity within MDIC is to apply this prospectively. We've conducted a retrospective study. We are looking at applying this idea of going to patients to explicitly identify the type 1 error allowable in a clinical trial in a prospective fashion for a hypothetical neuromodulation therapy. And I'll close because I know that we're close on time. MDIC has an annual public forum every year. We talk about regulatory science, and it's an opportunity to learn around what we've accomplished. We offer it through in-person, which will be in Washington, D.C., but we also offer it by WebEx, September 21st, and it is free, so you can join that WebEx for free, but you do need to register. And we'll have keynotes from the Commissioner of the FDA, from Jeff Shuren, the Director of CDRH, as well as the CEO and President from MDIC, and then updates on the various projects I told you about. So I encourage you to become interested in the new science of regulatory science and envisioning how this can help you bridge that valley of death, if you will, between the science of your product and the practice of your product. Thank you.